Let's come to our presentation. This is actually the 17th of our year, and there will be 52. And so we're gaining now that first third, and the ancient way to hunt with a spear, or to play the Olympics in the original with throwing a javelin, is to grab it 2/3 back from the point, 1/3 from the end, for the power thrust. And so we're going to do a little power thrust today, this week. We're looking at a way which is stronger than a renaissance, more lasting than a reformation, more changing than a revolution. We're looking at a recalibration of civilization. The way in which an analytic of time has influenced civilization goes back to the beginnings of literacy on a level where there was at least a seed community of men and women who could read and write. This generation is classically enshrined in the beginnings of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, with Adam and Eve. And it was the good Bishop Ussher in Ireland who computed some 100 years ago that if you take all of the dates in the book of Genesis for years and so forth, one traces Adam and Eve back to 4004 BC, which is extraordinary because it is very close to the actual time. Let's say 4000 BC. The myth that Adam and Eve have eaten an apple out of the tree of discrimination between good and evil and are therefore exiled from Eden before they can eat from the fruit of the tree of life is completely a distorted myth, as most myths that are ancient are. We have, in our time, in the early 21st century, been progressively aware for the last several centuries, 3 centuries almost, that we have to extricate ourselves from flawed myths. It isn't that myths and mythology itself is suspect, but that it has been manipulated in civilization to where the mythic quality of experience, the oral telling of stories, of relationships between nature and the divine and supernatural and man, which had and still do have a legitimacy in cultures, have suffered greatly from the truncations, the distortions, the deceptions of civilization, so that the mythic horizon, which in nature is a great part of the maturation of a developing species of intelligence, when it comes to the ability to power up the access of integral comprehension by a symbolic structure in our mentality. What suffers most of all is the distortion of a culture's mythic horizon, so that one begins to have more and more what we suffered through in the 20th century, and that is the state empire's manipulation of myth. And in consequence, because myth is extremely powerful in its expression, not only as mythology in a culture, but as art in a civilization. The state took over both in Nazi Germany, in Soviet Russia, in military Japan, and everywhere like the Roman Empire and many other empires, so that art was co-opted at the same time that the cultural mythology was distorted. We're looking at a massive recalibration, which has barely begun its harvest. But the preparation has been long, and so these presentations are a harvesting. And it is an ancient tradition that the first fruits of a harvest be offered in thanks for the ability to have understood how we live now in a more sophisticated way. Not by hunting and gathering, not by willy-nilly planting, not by chance taming, and certainly not limited anymore to a precious few coterie who manufacture for themselves a commandeering of the literate capacity to read and write freely. When I first began in the early 1980s, that's almost 35 years ago, to explore this technique, I had already spent several decades at the university level. And so the material that originally came out was in the form of essays that were almost classic in their presentation. And in the third volume of what eventually will be the set of Jesus in Alexandria and Mary Magdalene, Our Origins of Shared Presence, that third volume will be all of the appendices brought up to date, brought up to roughly 2015 when they will come out. The first two of those appendices, number one, the origin, is Pythagorean cosmos communities. K on cosmos, because the Greek is very much a special use of the term, which the Latin cosmos with a C doesn't actually cover adequately. Pythagoras was both a scientist and traditionally called also a mystic, but the quality that is mystic to those who understood that he was a mathematician is that he was a musician who was able to understand the principles of composition and was the first to be able to make the correlation between mathematics and music. And this is the opening paragraph of the opening appendix written in the early 1980s. This material concerning Pythagoras and Pythagorean cosmos communities is very difficult to hear about without prejudice, and even more difficult to read about without preconceptions. The myth and the symbols become progressively more distorting, more deceptive, more impenetrable. This actually provides us with exactly the kinds of challenges of prejudice and preconception concerning Jesus and Mary Magdalene, not to mention Jesus and Mary Magdalene as originating shared presence tuning pairs. The second of the appendices is on the teacher of righteousness. And the first paragraph reads, the Hebrew phrase, which translates as the teacher of righteousness, is Morach HaSedek. Parallel to this is the phrase Messiah HaSedek, which translates into the Messiah of righteousness. The teacher comes first, then in sequential parallel, the Messiah. The teacher begins, the Messiah culminates. The teacher sets the pattern of seeking, gathers the congregation, and points out the vision. The Messiah completes the pattern of seeking, confirms the congregation in its final form, and perfects the vision. He makes it all true. We have been looking at the teacher of righteousness, and now we're going to change his name. It is better to call him the teacher of wisdom vision. The reason for this is that the two outstanding books by him that dominate the culmination of what is called the Old Testament, the original Bible, the book of Job and the book of Daniel, and they are both by him, written by him. Written, in fact, in such a way that there is a half century in between them. He was a young, sophisticated Alexandrian Jew, probably third generation from those translators brought to Alexandria to translate the sacred Hebrew writings into Greek. And there were, on invitation from the first Ptolemy, to be 6 from each of the 12 tribes, making 72, and preparations were to be made where on the island where the great lighthouse of Pharos was located, they would be given a small enclave where they and their families could live and to set up so that this would be a special translating village, a community, if you will. And it was culminated by Ptolemy's second, Philadelphus, by making sure that all the preparations were ready. And it was at this time that the Jewish community of Alexandria, which was always there from the planning, from the beginnings. One has to understand this about Alexander the Great. It was his vision that there be, in Greek, an oikumene, in Latin, an ecumene, that all of mankind be seen, be visionable, be beholdable as a family, the family of man. And in order to do this, there needed to be a new thread to bring together all of the beads of the various cultures, all of the gems of the various civilizations into a necklace, and it needed to have a thread that could go through all of them. And this thread was twofold. It had to be a thread which had a practique application. It had to be able to reach out to the actual political economy, as we would say today, of all of the cultures, of all of the nascent experiments with civilization, and bring them all together into this necklace. That same thread would have to have the experience of very long, almost world trading routes. And the original long trading route that was known at that time was the trading route developed by Sargon of Akkad, the North Semitic peoples that came together with Sargon, who ruled for 56 years in Akkad, who was able to knit together, first of all, the 42 different city-state, 42 different temples of Sumerian mythology and background into a unity which then was called Akkad, the Akkadian Empire, aided by his daughter Enheduanna, who was able to give the second part of that. Not only a trading route that spanned, at the time, Sargon's trading route went from Cyprus in the Mediterranean Sea to the Indus River civilization bordering on the Ganges River and the northern Himalayas, the Hindu Kush. And so one had this enormous swath 4,400 years ago. It was the Semitic, northern Semitic peoples who did this. They also developed a quality of language that increasingly utilized the cuneiform writing that was able to interface with other forms of writing, some of them still not translatable. The Indus River, it's because of one of the great cities there, Harappa, the other one was Mohenjo-Daro. The Harappan civilization had pictographs, petroglyphs, like hieroglyphs, like early Chinese, which have still not been able to be translated. The quality of being able to write so that one could read was opening the portals of the access to vision, to a field of vision, wherein one could do a transform of the mentality of symbolic structures, at the same time reach down and encourage and tease out and bring back to life the mythic horizon of a whole variety of cultures, so that one then had the essence, as it were, of the various kinds of beginnings of civilization and the great spread and splendor of the mythic horizon of all cultures that one would come into contact with. And with those two, one could reach back and be able to bring new, recalibrated ritual bases into play. And all of this would refresh not only the well of reaching down to Mother Nature's field, original field, but reaching up to Father transforms conscious field of vision. And to bring this together, Enheduanna is the world's first great writer of personal name that we know of. Yes, there were some beginnings of writing, but it is with Enheduanna that the other aspect of Sargon's Akkadian empire, that civilization that had the trading routes, now also had the ability to have a literate language that was readable across the entire swath and scalar of these trading routes, so that there then again was the ability for that recalibration to have new centers of quality. One of the centers was the interface between Mesopotamia and India, and that center was in northern Iran. The other center was in between the Mesopotamia again of Akkad and the Mediterranean island communities and coastal communities. And within sight of Cyprus, there was a peninsula, a spit of land coming out from the East Mediterranean coast, which is today in Syria. And that coast was called, in ancient times, Ras Shamra. It means it is the point of fennel. Wild fennel was cultivated, and you had that as one of the crops there. And from Ras Shamra, within sight not only of Cyprus, but the further reach into the Mediterranean, all the way to Rhodes, to Crete, to those islands of the Aegean. And of course, following the islands went up all the way to Samos, Samothrace, and the northern coast of Thrace, and the farther coast that led into the Black Sea. It was at Ras Shamra, at a city called Ugarit, that alphabetical language was first developed there, and it was in northern, what was the ancient Irani area, in what is today Kabul in Afghanistan, that the other development of alphabetical language happened, and they were tuned. So that the place that is called Antioch and the place that is called Kabul were the twin tuning forks of the way in which an alphabetical language came into play. And that was 2,000 years after Adam and Eve in 2000 BC. And the archetypal way in which that is deposited in the time forms of civilization that by that time, by 2000 BC, were not only beginning to gel, but that one had the experience of a tremendous renaissance some 500 years before that, about 2500 BC, where not only was the building techniques in Egypt able finally to build the Great Pyramids, but the building techniques in the farther reaches already of civilization in its swath, all the way to the British and Irish Isles off the continent that became Europe. One had the great perfection of architectural beginnings that went all the way back to about 3200 BC. By 2500 BC, they were refined enough to have two great places, the Boyne River in Ireland and the Salisbury Plain in the west of Britain, where at the Salisbury Plain, Stonehenge was finalized by having the great trilithons, the blue stones, mined in Wales and brought all the way there through great travail and engineering and architectural genius. And to have Stonehenge as the great jewel of a whole pattern of communities, centers in the Salisbury Plain, reaching all the way back to Ireland, where there was a great community around Newgrange, which is about 3200 BC, and with Noath and Douth, you had a triangle, a triumvirate, and in that Boyne River, these three were matched together as a great equilateral triangle in Ireland, with the 3 in the Giza Plateau of Egypt. Those 3 stars are the belt of Orion, those 3 great pyramids, and those 3 in Newgrange, Noath, and Douth, Ireland, are the great equilateral triangle that is related to them. That equilateral triangle is Sirius for Osiris, Sirius, Procyon, they called Sirius the dog star. This is before the dog star, Procyon, and Betelgeuse, if you like, Betelgeuse from the Arabic, a great yellow star in Orion, so that the ancient Celtic and the ancient Egyptian have an interface. They have an interface between Orion and this great equilateral triangle at the same time. In Mesopotamia, by this time, a great development had happened at Ur. And Ur, in the south of that Akkadian Sumerian, the trading route center was called the Fertile Crescent because it went from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. But that was only the beginnings of like an Isis moon of a whole cycle of understanding. And there, one began to find a vision which was characteristically a culmination of an ionic carrier wave, of a 2,000-year carrier wave, reaching back 2,000 years to 4,000 BC, when the literate language was first large enough to have a population characterized by Adam and Eve, who could read and write, who were not at all thrown out of Eden or exiled from Eden, but who walked out because they could no longer remain in that simple, natural garden, and they went out to explore, like Sargon's great trading routes, went out to explore what else is there that we can find and adventure to, and eventually inhabit, and eventually expand and refine, and so forth. And so it is not an exile from Eden, it is the beginnings, the trigger of what led 2,000 years later to the great vision of Abraham that there was a new promised land, and that this new promised land was going to be fertile specifically for growing the crop, if you will, the population, if you must understand, of those being able to access vision beyond just reading and writing, of being able to not only enter into vision through reading and writing through a written language, but to carry the quality of prismatic person that came out of this and reach the next phase where one would be able to have a kaleidoscopic consciousness of history. And by developing a kaleidoscopic consciousness that took the differential consciousness of vision and gave it yet another dimension, not only a quintessential fifth dimension of vision, making a prismatic person sixth dimension of art, but those who were artists in becoming not only making works of art, but their person became a work of art. They became prismatic, capable of having a jewel-like quality, which kaleidoscopic history is actually the dimension that comes into play as a seventh dimension. And so Abraham with Sarai, later when she would have a child, her name became Sarah. They gathered those few relatives and persons in their entourage and went in quest of the promised land. They knew roughly where it would be, and they went to find exactly where the beginning would be. And the beginning, the first time that a piece of land was purchased by Abraham, was a cave called the Cave of Machpelah, which is still there. It's in Hebron, up on the high ridge. It's where Abraham and Sarah are buried. It's where their son Isaac and his wife Rebekah are buried. They are still there. The tombs are still there. This is all true. The quality of the way in which dimensions of civilization gel increasingly, clearly, powerfully, expansively in the way in which civilization recalibrates itself again and again, refining out to, in our time, with a new carrier wave, with a very clear, very vast vision. Our field of the universe is now 14 billion years, light years, and counting. We're going adventuring on a scalar that is not even imaginable except to a small community of people through the ages, as it were, but who began to cluster about 100 or so years ago into what we gave here at this chair 52 presentations under the aegis of the science fiction vision. That science fiction vision now is fruitful in the grandchildren's generation. It is out of the history, the kaleidoscopic history, that comes the refinement of science. Science itself emerging. There was really no science to speak of until Pythagoras. Someone at JPL told me one time, we're all Pythagoreans. We understand. We still have concerts. We still do our math. We increase the refinement of the math every month, every year. And we increase our ability to appreciate the music, the architecture, the qualities that are there. And we're not only going to go, we are going. Further, faster, but more real. We're going to take a little break and come back. The teacher of righteousness, the teacher of vision, wisdom, the vision in the book of Job that the divine is real. For us, there is an access. And the wisdom is not plannable, but doable in terms of preparation over long periods of time. In the book of Daniel, it was going to be 490 years. 7 times 7, tenfold. The ancient quality of harvesting was that every 7 Sabbaths, every 49 days, there was a 50th day, which was a jubilee. And that jubilee was the festival of first fruits. And during the cycle of a year, there would be 7 jubilees. 7 times 50, which gives you 350 days in that year, with 2 sevens plus its special jubilee. That 15 days added to the 350 gives you the annual solar calendar of 365 days and a quarter, because in that special 15th day after the 14, there's always a furthering that is included, so that the integral is not stopped at completeness, but continues on to perfection. Let's take a break. Let's come back. Between the book of Job, written about 210 BC, and the book of Daniel, written about 160 BC, is a time in that 50 years where the energies between Alexandria and the promised land of Judea especially began to take hold and have a powerful, colossal, explosive interchange. The documents that came out from that are torrential. And the first one is called the Vision of Enoch. And the Vision of Enoch is written about 196 BC. It comes at a time when all of a sudden, as if the phrase, "the cat is out of the bag," occurs, the presence of aliens on this planet becomes not only known, talk about science fiction vision, but becomes dystopic, which is also part of the science fiction vision. The written revelation of that beginning, and the book of Enoch eventually would have 5 parts, but the thumb was missing. Only 4 of the 5 parts, only the fingers, occur at what was beginning to be developable in what then was the future. And the documents collected of what then was to be in the future is our distant past. It is the community at Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea. And in the great tragedy that happened to the Qumran community, natural tragedy, a catastrophe, in 31 BC, an earthquake of unbelievable exactness and proportions sent a fracture through the Qumran community, exactly through the central building of the Qumran community, which was the scriptorium, where they copied book after book by the hundreds, almost into 1,000 volumes. 4 of the sections of the book of Enoch are there in the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of them is not there because it had not been written yet in 31 BC. And that earthquake fracture not only sent a ground lightning split through the scriptorium, but it fractured the pool of water and the steps going down to that pool of water, where there was a baptismal quality of cleansing in the Dead Sea community, and the whole community was abandoned. Until 60 years later, 6-0, that 5 times 12, that quintessential 12th tribe collection. It is in 29 AD that the Qumran community is reinstated, and the reinstatement of the Qumran community is epical. And the figure who reinstated the Qumran community did so by reinstating baptism, but not in the community limited to it, but expansive, and taking not just a little pool of water that had been struck by earth lightning, that ends now, and something further, something more expansive will begin when the vision is matured. And when the vision is matured, the baptism will begin again, but this time in the Jordan River that feeds with fresh water the Dead Sea, and no longer on the edge of a Dead Sea, but at the way in which the fruitful living waters from Mount Hermon's melting snow comes all the way there to this special ford in the Jordan River. And the person who reinstated the expanded, completely recalibrated Qumran was John the Baptist. And he did it in such a way that it initiated the last 7-year cycle. So that from 29 AD to 36 AD, in that final Sabbath week of years, John the Baptist refounded an expanded, recalibrated community that was originally set up by the teacher of vision wisdom, to its culmination with the crucifixion and resurrection of John the Baptist's younger cousin, Jesus. We are looking at the way in which a carrier wave has catastrophic preludes. It has long preparation that finally, when it comes to register, nothing in cultures or in the quality of constructs of civilization affects it. It's called when the day comes, that's the day. We live in a time where that day is right pronto, and that its trigger was in 1991. And all of us who are here were quite conscious of an extraordinary aspect when, in massive desert camouflage with gas masks, tens of thousands of troops entered into southern Iraq, where all of the almost 700 oil wells were set on fire, so that plumes, columns, a forest of black smoke of burning oil darkened the entire day for days. The land of Sargon and Eneduana was under a pall of technological night, of end of the aeon triggering, whose aftershocks is still going on to this day, to this hour. And that in between that, the dawn in Jerusalem, in the Promised Land, is tuned to the dawn in Kabul, in what is today, conveniently, Afghanistan. And that there is a hidden quality of dimensions of civilization that is hardly guessable and received a deceptive bad guess. When I was born in October of 1940, the Nazi commandeering of the Aryan race as being sophisticated and needed to eliminate the Semitic Jewish race is a massive evil, a catastrophic misunderstanding, civilizations deep, of what the time forms actually are being the metronome of, not in some basic repeatable cycle. It's not about a repetition. It's about a spiraling that increases in two chiral ways. One, it goes further and further in to the infinitesimally small, and the other further and further out to the infinitely large. On the net, Science Daily, one can find almost daily. What does one find? Closing in on the border between primordial plasma and ordinary matter at the Large Hadron Collider just outside of Geneva. Curiously, it's only a bicycle's ride of a couple of hours at most from the estate where Voltaire and his lady of many, many years, Madame de Châtelet, worked on making a translation of the Latin of Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica into an elegant French, so that it was the elegant French of that generation who were able to read Newton freshly, not in that stilted Latin which was used for the original Principia, but in this Voltairean quality of elegant, Madame du Châtelet's great quality of penetrating exactness and elegance herself, that a whole generation of French mathematical geniuses and French geniuses of changing civilization all took place. So that the development of Fourier's series in mathematics, the development of Lagrange's understanding of gravity and Lagrange points where gravity between the bodies and the sun even out so that there is very little gravity exactly at those 5 Lagrange spots. And by 2018 at L2, we will have the most powerful scientific instrument ever built, the James Webb Space Telescope, that will make Hubble look like a toy. And it will be positioned 1 million miles off the surface of the Earth. And what is space? It's a point of rest that was understood by Madame de Châtelet and Voltaire through Newton, that this is exactly where one can come to a new beginning. out of this rest is not a dead rest. It is a living, fertile beginning. It is a fertile zero. It is a cooperative infinity. And at the same time that one had this generation of great French mathematicians, Newtonians all, coming into play, one had the development in France of the French Revolution that tore everything down. What royals? What privilege? What hegemony? What heritage do you have that we do not have? We are citizens of man. And this is year one. In England, William Blake's prophetic vision quality was operative in coming into play, and the great prophetic books of Blake, the great prophetic poetry of Shelley, and the great prophetic novels of Mary Shelley, all of this coming out and coming forth, the quality of the old Benjamin Franklin saying, "At last I can leave this France in good hands because it's going to all be taken care of, all of it, because Mr. Jefferson is coming to take over from me." And he did. All of this is waves upon waves of preludes, increasing in its scope, and always there is this quality of the aliens among us. A seminar on the book of Enoch in its fivefold quintessential qualities has been held for the last every 3 years or so. This is Enoch and Qumran Origins. Gabriele Boccassini, who is at University of Michigan. And a couple of years later, a couple of meetings later, half a dozen years later, Enoch and the Messiah, Son of Man. Because in addition to the original vision of Enoch is a second vision of Enoch that is not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that wasn't written in 31 BC, because the author of the second vision of Enoch was only born in 31 BC. He was born at the same time. Who knows, the same month? Could it be the same day that the earth lightning struck an end to the Essene community? Not to kill it, but to give it a pause, that phase, that stage is over. And he grew up to be Joseph, the father of Jesus. And when Jesus was 12, already beginning his bar mitzvah preparation year, which is why they discovered that he wasn't with the caravan returning back to their craft community. Nazareth was not a city. It was never even a village. It was a craft community because they were all rebuilding Sepphoris, the great city in that valley, which was the capital at that time, that whole section of Palestine. So they went back, and Joseph found him in the temple, arguing, because he was not only receiving instructions pertaining to his year of preparation for the bar mitzvah, he was giving instructions at the same time. And so Joseph recognized that it was time for the 12-year-old genius Jesus to go back to where he was brought up for the first 5 years of his life, back to Alexandria. And so he wrote the second vision of Enoch. Enoch and the Messiah, Son of Man, because the three parables in the second vision of Enoch are the 1, 2, 3 parable preparation of Jesus and the way he would teach the rest of his life. And the way that he was sent back to Alexandria was not overland. He was sent by ship, by a Semitic-owned trading route on the Mediterranean, not only the coasts, but across the Mediterranean. It had been Semitically owned for thousands of years at that time. It was there when Sargon and Eniduwana founded that whole quality of Akkad, reaching out all the way to Cyprus and all the way to the Indus River valleys. And all of this was launched from Tyre, Tyre. Because it is at Tyre that the original exploring port of mariners on the Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean means the Middle Sea. The Middle Sea of the middling of the world, of the way in which fulcrum after fulcrum come to a place where the top pivot spins here. And Tyre had been that for almost 2 millennia. Tyre was not located exactly on the coast. It was on an island off the coast. So that one had to take shuttle boats about a mile or so out to the island. And the great mariner exploring empire of the city of Tyre was from that little island. And it was never conquered until someone named Alexander the Great was as determined to succeed as anything would ever stand in his way. And he built patiently a mole of rocks and debris out to the island of Tyre, and by linking it, sent his legions over and conquered. And got the idea when he saw the island of Pharos off the Egyptian coast, we're going to make a mole in commemorative of the way in which we took over the Tyre millennial long, aeon long shipping rate of the whole Mediterranean out into the Atlantic Ocean. The sailors from Tyre founded Carthage 800 BC. They founded what became Marseille 600 BC. By the time of Pythagoras, they were already beginning to sail out through the Straits of Gibraltar. And eventually, in Ptolemaic times, when the 72 translators were put on the island of Pharos to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek, it's still published. The Septuagint, the 70. There's a new translation now that is even better than the one that we all used for the last 50 years or more, just now. That quality of the resonances, when they are put into a harmonic set, now you can make music. You can compose a civilization that has that musical elegance, that architectural capacity to inspire and not just stand there, but to dynamically bring all who come into participation with that scalar of perfection. Now one can have something which we will live to see, a new Jerusalem, as a planetary park, like a national park of the planet, of the species, that belongs to everyone and not just to someone. Not just to those, not those others. To these, but not to those. It will be a part of the way in which the family of man finally grows up and stops hating and killing for only reasons of deception and ignorance and stupidity, including the aliens. They will have to learn as well, because there are star system civilizations beyond count that know them very well for the kind of cheap, piratical, tyranny-loving, deceptive critters that they apparently are very proud to be. Pride cometh before the fall, and that fall comes like earth lightning rather quickly. The vision, the phrase in the book of Revelation, behold, I come quickly, real soon. The quality in the book of Daniel and the quality in the book of Job are like great parentheses that have the development of Qumran. The Essenes had taken umbrage against the increasing encroachments of the Persian Empire reaching to try to take over everything into its empire under Antiochus IV, and for 20 years they were wondering, how do we begin and where do we begin? And exile had taken them into Damascus, and from Alexandria, the teacher of vision, wisdom, contacted them and brought them back to the site where Qumran would be and established there the community. And not only the community of a few who would keep a vigilance in a new calendar, the calendar of the book of Jubilees. Come the Jubilee, that's the day. And come the set of the Jubilees that brings the harvest full, the harvest is in. Those who will eat, partake. There's a Hopi myth about catastrophes that happened to the ancestors in the deep southwest in ancient times. That the grasshoppers came because there was so much to eat, and they were eating everything, and the Hopi people had a little message from small creatures, the smallest of creatures, that tough times were going to come, and one would have to, don't join the locusts, join the ants. And we'll all tighten our belts, and that's why ants have such a tiny little waist, because you had to tighten your belt to that. And there was a time when the locusts had eaten all of their food, and there was no more food, and they all died off. Extinction. And the ants survived. And the ancient saying, the will of the ant is a truth of nature. We have, fortunately, people like the author of The Interpretation of Dreams in the Ancient Near East, with a translation of an Assyrian dream book. A. Leo Oppenheim was a great professor in Chicago, at the University of Chicago. When the University of Chicago was set up, Chicago was the upcoming great city in the world. It wasn't on the East Coast or the West Coast, it was in the center of the continent. All the railroads were built so that all the railroads met in Chicago. The freight yards in Chicago were like Grand Central Station for the commerce of a burgeoning Renaissance United States. Not only the economy, but the art. And the University of Chicago was set up to be, from the get-go, like building San Francisco, or later on building Johns Hopkins University outside of Baltimore, or building Stanford, to be world-class. And the Oriental Institute was financed by great expeditions that were sent to bring back enough of the Egyptian materials, enough of the Assyrian materials, of the Mesopotamian, of the Akkadian, so that the Oriental Institute, at the time headed by J. Leo Oppenheim, his great book near the end of his life, Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. That subsets of civilization can die because they have no more food to feed that subset. It isn't that civilization dies, it's that the subsets that were not wise, without vision, they quickly perish. The prophetic word behold is extremely important, and next presentation we'll talk about the book of Daniel, where Daniel is so powerful in his wisdom. He is able to teach the visioning quality, but the learner of the visions did not have them originally, but only did it through a method inculcation, a kind of a false learning that gave a false vision, so that one could only have a vision within a dream, not the real McCoy, which is the ability to go from dreaming and thinking you know about vision to really having vision, access on a scalar that is infinite. The phrase in Egyptian, from eternity to eternity. Oppenheim's death prevented him from finishing his second edition, and so Erica Reimer finished it for him. She succeeded him at the University of Chicago and the Oriental Institute, and in 1977, his original book was revised, now almost 40 years later. All of this material is extremely valuable. Who published this? Transactions of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia, for promoting useful knowledge, founded by Benjamin Franklin. Still publishing, still operating. There's a sub-basement room in the Huntington Library, where one whole wall of this room are all the issues of the American Philosophical Society's transactions, thousands of them, for almost 300 years. It has nothing to do with political parties. It has to do with a Hermetic America that goes back exactly to what we are talking about as origins. More next week.